I've tailored the presentation to address agribusiness people. So I can see a few farmers here, and I'm sure there's a few out in the other areas. But hopefully I can bridge between the two of them. But it's really talking to agribusiness people. And look, if there's any questions as I go, if you want any clarification, just put your hand up. People out in the offices there, I don't know how you do that, but I'll keep an eye on the screen maybe. What I want to make the point was that this presentation is a bit of a team effort between myself and Ed Riggle. Just on the first slide there, I had Ed's name and his logo, so just to acknowledge this is not just me, it's Ed Riggle as well. Ed presented down at Albany, but between the two of us, we've sort of put the thing together. I understand in some areas of the state, it's not just a poor year, it's quite severe. You'll see later from the Pastures in Space people just the extent and severity of how bad it is in some of those areas. So I acknowledge it's not just a poor year for a large area, but there is quite severe conditions in the north and east of the wheat belt. But I just want to make the point, this is what we say to clients, is that a poor season doesn't happen overnight, it's quite an incremental process, and the real problem with that is you don't just wake up one day and think, oh gee, it's not good. It often creeps up on you, and people sort of go through the phase of just thinking it's going to rain, hoping it's going to rain, waiting and waiting and waiting. And then at some stage it becomes blatantly obvious that things aren't going very well and decisions need to be made. The issue is the timing of that's very important to the options that you've got and how effective those options can be employed. And the real risk I see with people is they just not procrastinate, but the decisions become too big and too hard, and they leave it longer and longer and longer until they're left with two options, potentially, both of them very unpalatable and potentially quite expensive, and it's very difficult to make decisions in that environment. So one thing we reiterate all the time is it's important to have some sort of cues that alert you that decisions need to be made. Look, things aren't going well, it's the end of May, it hasn't rained. What does that mean really? It's the first week of June, it hasn't rained. What does that mean? To keep people on track with making decisions and keeping their options open and choosing options at the best time when those options can add value to the business. So that's the sort of key message that we generally trot out in a season like this. It's about just being proactive and be decisive. Now with sheep, there's really two decisions that you need to make. Do I need to increase carrying capacity? So do I need to produce more feed for my sheep to carry the sheep that I have, or do I need to simply reduce demand? So whatever decisions we make with sheep fall into those two categories. And it's important to recognise what phase am I in. Am I simply just trying to carry the sheep that I've got, or have I got to the phase where I need to reduce demand? Because there's key decisions that go along with those two components. Now typically, increase carrying capacity, we do it all the time. Every year we start feeding sheep. Now some years we feed a bit earlier, a bit longer, a bit more than others. Typically we might reduce crop, increase pasture area. These are all things that are designed around just carrying what we've got. And then we go down to simply just offloading sheep to reduce the overall feed demand. Adjusting and early stock sales. It's just all about less mouths to feed, less cost. Let's just make do with a core group of sheep. Now at the moment for a lot of areas, I think we're way past this. This is not working. We're way past this increased carrying capacity phase. From most of the areas I expect we're in this trying to rationalise demand. And today, myself and John will go through trying to prioritise where do we start that process and where do we stop, if in fact do we stop. But the idea is to give you some guidelines to help when you talk to your clients and for the farmers in the audience, when you're making these decisions, what's the framework to help make those decisions in a rational and objective way. Now, part of the program is it really helps with sheep to have what we call an exit strategy. So it's just basically a pre-planned structure as to how we're going to manage seasons as they come. Now this is what we call an exit strategy. I guess we invented it, for the want of a better word, through the program called the Sheep's Back some years ago. And the whole idea is it's to give people confidence to lift their stocking rate, knowing that if the season's not going with them, there's an orderly, thought-out plan to back out of the season and keep things in control. Now what we've got here is, this is tricky. Okay, this is the date of the break. Now in this example, if it rains, if the season breaks on the 1st of May, the carrying capacity for this farm is 11 DSE, but they're only stocked to carry 8. All right, so they're potentially understocked for a 1st of May break, but that's not the issue here. It's not until we get to, say, the 28th of May break that you can see the carrying capacity of the farm is below the stock that we're carrying. So there's a 1 DSE deficit in carrying capacity. So what do? We just buy some feed. That's quite normal. There's nothing unusual about that. Just buy another load of lupins. That's increased the carrying capacity by 500 DSE, and that's fixed that. But if it doesn't rain until the 4th of June, carrying capacity of the farm's down to 6 DSE. So there's a 2 DSE deficit. We start to sell some sheep, so we're reducing demand. And if it gets down to the 18th of June, we've reduced our stocking rate to 5 DSE, but there's still a deficit of 1 DSE in carrying capacity. We're looking at buying some more feed. So this is just an orderly plan as to how we might manage the season as it unfolds. And what we find is that when this plan is developed before we get into this sort of situation, it's usually a little bit more well thought out and people have something to work to. It keeps people in control and gives them confidence that things are manageable. Okay. So I think obviously 18th of June, we're way past that. But that's just to give you some flavour as to how we as sheep consultants sort of handle these sort of poor seasons to late breaks. Okay, now, bearing in mind some areas probably won't have a spring, the implications of a poor spring is that it really reduces the cheap feed that we normally fatten our sheep on. So normally in the spring, it's when we put condition back on our ewes, we grow our lambs, we get things ready for the summer, for sale, and with the ewes, we get them ready for joining for next year. Now, anything that affects our spring has a huge effect on the condition of our sheep going into summer. So that's probably the first implication for the future of the current season. And I think that's something important to remember, that it's quite likely in most areas of the state we'll have a very reduced spring flush, which feeds into sheep live weight gain either for lambs, adult sheep, which then affects carrying capacity and live weight performance through summer. Now it's important to recognise that when things aren't going well, there's this phase that people go through. You know, initially when it's not raining, we're hoping it's going to rain next week. There's a bit of worry when it's getting later, and then we get to mad panic in some degrees. When it hasn't rained, it's June, what do we do? Now, this is all normal, and I think it's important to let clients go through that phase, but I think it's useful just to recognise that this is quite a normal sort of process, but the trick is to get from this worry panic phase to decisions and actions. So let yourself go through it, but then it's important to go quickly from panic, okay, we've got to make decisions, we've got to do something. Because procrastination is just a disaster. Nothing benefits from doing nothing. Any decision is better than no decision in situations like this, no question. So what we say to clients is simply work to a plan. Now the exit strategy is a plan. Other people may have a different plan, but have a plan and work to it with discipline. You can change the plan, but you must have a plan, otherwise you just... Okay, now it's important to understand where you are physically. What have you got in terms of grain? What have you got in terms of sheep, infrastructure, water, people? What have I got? What can I manage? And importantly, how much cash have I got access to? Money in the bank or bank finance? Because that provides some constraints on what your options might be and what you can do and what your time frame is. If you don't have much money or access to cash, working capital, you've got real time constraints and you've got to be pretty nimble on your feet and make good decisions quickly. If you're pretty well financed, you've got lots of options and a very long time frame, and it's useful to recognise that. And I guess emotionally, this is a tricky one because It's normal to be stressed in these sort of times, but when the stress is affecting your decision making, that creates problems for the business and yourself. Now, the problem is with this is typically the people in that position aren't the ones who can do anything about it. So it's relying on people around them to help them make decisions. So when we're talking to clients, often I come in and I just sit them down and we just add a bit of structure to their decision-making process. And that's often all it takes, is to say, look, we've got to make some decisions. These are the options. How about we work to this plan? And often that's enough to get them back on track. But it's not much value to them saying, look, mate, you've got to take control. Because if they're in that position, they're not in a position to do that on their own. So they need help. I think that's my message there. Now, it's very important when we're in these sort of conditions to be objective as possible, because we need decisions with clarity and we need decisions based on fact and objective. Emotional, subjective decisions have a real risk of being inappropriate. Intuition, gut feel is quite relevant, but we've got to be careful we've got to be careful to be objective wherever possible. Good decisions, bad decisions, wrong decisions, right decisions. What do I mean by that? Look, good decisions relates to what's a good decision for me and my business today, tomorrow, next year. What makes good business sense? Now, when I'm talking wrong or right, I'm sort of thinking that's more of a punt. You know, I'm having a guess, I'm taking a chance. Okay, I reckon if it rains in spring, I can do this today. That's great, but what if it doesn't rain in spring? What's the downside? A good decision is, okay, it might rain in spring, but it might not. And if it doesn't, this is the consequence for me and my business. That's not going to be good. So a good decision is to do something that mitigates that risk. And if it does rain in spring, well, that's great, but you've still made a good decision to mitigate the risk to your business. Taking a punt, I guess the point I'm making is it's fine to take a punt or to take a chance on something, but if you can't wear the risk of it not paying off, that's a bad decision for your business. If it turns out, great. If it doesn't, look out. So I think it's important to categorise decisions. Is this a good, bad decision, or is it wrong, right? Because that puts you in the framework as to good business decisions, having a punt. Now, there's nothing wrong with having a punt, but just be conscious that's what you're doing. Because if it doesn't pay off and you're not prepared for the downside, it's potentially quite bad for your business and yourself, quite likely. Okay, so what I'm saying to clients is we want to focus on the next 2 or 3 months. Now, if we try and focus on the next 6 months, there's just too many variables at play that we can't pin down to be able to make good decisions at the moment. So let's just keep our time frame short, and when we get to sort of September, late August, we've got more information, we can then make decisions for the next 2 or 3 months after that. But at the same time, we need to have a view on, okay, what could happen in 6 months? Best case, worst case, most likely. So it's great to have a view as to what could happen, but in our day-to-day planning, I think it's more appropriate to focus on the next 2 or 3 months, because we know with a bit of certainty what's likely to happen given what's going on today. And it's really important to stay in control. And this is where people like us dealing with farmers, if we see people floundering a bit, it's important to try and get them back on track, because they can't function if they're not in control. And if you can't do anything for them, it'd be handy to find someone who might be able to. Saying to them, mate, you got to get back on track, that's probably not going to be enough for some people. And look, at the end of the day, we're probably in a position where we're just trying to minimise loss. It's not about profit, it's about trying to shut the business down as best we can and cap the loss as best we can, which means cost control on all levels. It's not one particular thing, it's just cost control across the board to try and minimise that loss. So the questions we're asking the clients is simply, have you got a plan? What's your plan? If you don't have a plan, let's put one down. Let's get one organised. What's the worst case you can think of? And I'll tell you what, people can be pretty pessimistic when they want to be. But what do we think's most likely? Because I think that's really the path we try and tread. What's most likely, with an eye on what's potentially the worst we can expect. just consider the risks that you think are rational. And most importantly, I think, get a grip on the cash flow. How much cash have we got? Because that really gives us options and time frame. It's very important. Now, budgeting's super important, I think, because it gives us a sense of control. It helps us stay objective about what's really going to happen, and it helps capture a firm view on our cash flow and a capacity to take advantage of various options. But to make that useful, we've got to monitor the budget closely. So month to month, budget to actual, so we know exactly where we're going. If we're overspending or underspending, it's quite clear. And it helps keep us in tune with our cash capabilities. You know, what operating capital have we got access to? But most importantly, I think it just helps keep people having a sense of control, that we know what's going on, this is what we can do. Okay, so look, in summary, it's just about making good decisions. In times of crisis like this, it's good decisions that get us through. It's minimising the loss, and we do that through making good decisions. It's fine to take a punt, have a guess, but you need to do that objectively and be really cognisant of what the real risk is if it doesn't pay off, and can I handle that? Because if the answer is no, you have to revert to another option, because if you can't handle the downside of that decision, it's potentially bad for your business, and we need to stay out of that sort of area. So while I'm suggesting we just focus on the next 2 or 3 months, we still need to have a view for what might be the worst outcome. Okay, now what I'll do now is really go into the feeding of sheep, but what I want to start with is just give you some sense of why we might even bother keeping sheep. Right, because I think this is a very important sort of component of the decision. Why would you bother keeping sheep when it all seems expensive and hard? Now, this is a historical perspective on sheep profitability going back to 1984. It's expressed as dollars of operating profit per DSE. Here's 1984, and it's up to 2016. Now, last year, the average profit for my clients, the people I deal with, was about $48 a DSE. Now, that's operating profit. So from that, we pay interest, drawings, tax, overheads like shire rates, insurances, and those sort of things. So there's a component of depreciation in that profit of $48. So it's an operating profit. Now, if you think back, if you're old enough to remember, this is the late 80s boom in wool, 1987 to 1989. So you can see to today, in nominal terms, is faring a lot better even back in the boom. But look, if we correct for CPI, we can see that today's profitability in sheep is very close to what it was in the late 80s. So there is a real boom in profit in sheep, and it is substantially higher than it has been. So there's nearly $50 a DSE of profit last year. Now, it'll be a lot less, it'll be a bit less this year because of seasonal reasons, but I think the fundamentals for sheep profitability are very strong. So there's no reason to expect it's going to come crashing down around our ears anytime soon. I'm not predicting it's going to be as good as it is, but the fundamentals are quite strong in that sheep profit will remain high. So there's good reason to think the future value of sheep is going to remain high. So there's good reason to keep sheep in the farm business. Now, part of that decision, I believe, is that you need to look at the sheep in the context of your farm operation and your farm business. What value do the sheep bring to your farm business? Do they have a lot of value? Is there a strong role for the sheep in your farm operation? Or are they a bit more of a hobby, superficial value? Because if they have a strong role, a lot of value, then that makes it more important to try and hang on to as many sheep as you can to get them into next year and the year after. If they don't have a lot of value, then it's a much easier decision to make whether I carry them or not carry them. Because to carry sheep through potentially a spring that you don't have, it's a lot of work, a fair bit of money, and there are risks. So I think it's important to really come to grips with, why have I got sheep? What value do they bring to me and my business, really? For a lot of people I deal with, they're mixed farmers truly, 50 to 60% of the farm's crop. Sheep have a real strong role to play and a lot of value. So keeping sheep for as long as we can adds real strength to our business and value. But the point about these graphs is just to demonstrate, look, that sheep are very, very profitable in a historical context. Now when we're feeding sheep, it's very simple, particularly at the moment. It's all about energy. All we're trying to do is get energy down the throats of our sheep. Protein's important to a limited extent. Now there are some sheep like weaners that need a bit more protein than others, but when we're looking at buying feed, feeding sheep, it's all about how much energy can we get down that sheep's throat. That's the big one. So when we're talking about comparing feed sources, it's about cents per megajoule of energy down their throat with a bit of protein. Now minerals, I've minimised minerals because from a supplementary feeding perspective, generally we don't need to worry too much about minerals. It's not a big part of the equation. So we shouldn't get distracted by whether they've got stock licks or whatever. It's not really an issue, particularly if you're feeding lupins. Okay, now adult dry sheep, in terms of maintenance, so they're not losing or gaining weight, 6 to 8 megajoules is the normal range in energy requirements for an adult sheep. Now for most wheat belt type sheep, it's probably closer to 8 megajoules, because generally they tend to be bigger, right? And in the summer, the maintenance energy requirement's a bit less because there's less going on with the sheep. And the environmental conditions are a bit more mild. When it kicks into a bit wet and cold, the maintenance requirement does go up a reasonable amount. But we generally work on around 8 to 8.5 megajoules for a dry adult sheep. Obviously when they're joined and lactating they need a lot more energy because there's a fair bit more going on with those sheep. Now look, this is the protein. Dry sheep maintaining energy only need a small amount of protein. Now most grain, even oats, would have 8% protein. So we don't need to worry about protein for adult sheep particularly because it doesn't really add any value to them. Weaners are the ones that need a reasonable amount of protein in the diet, and that's simply because they're growing. They have a strong growth requirement that they can't shut off. You can't stop weaners from growing. If you don't feed them enough protein, they just don't. The frame grows, but the muscle tissue doesn't, and they just get skinnier, and eventually they end up falling off the perch. So weaners have a real need for protein, and it's around 14%, and that's relatively easy to provide. In addition to all that, we also know that the energy range of grain varies considerably. Now this is just simply a typical range of energy, megajoules of energy per kilo for each of the grains that we normally feed sheep. So oats, 8 to 11, that's quite normal to see that level of range of energy. So when we're feeding oats, depending on what we've got, to maintain a dry animal, you can eat anything from 500 grams to a kilo. So there's a twofold variation purely driven by grain quality. So if we're looking at buying grain particularly, what's the one thing we need to know, ideally? It's the energy content, because we're buying energy, that's what we're buying. Now when you're buying grain out of Elders or wherever you buy it from, no one's going to have the energy values. But it's very useful information to have. Now lupins typically vary a lot less. They tend to be quite consistent, very high energy, very high protein. It does vary, but nothing like it varies with oats. You can see here 400 to 600 grams a head a day will maintain an adult sheep usually. And from my experience, that's generally true. And you can see the protein content, but generally we don't have trouble getting 8% protein in the diet for sheep. The point I was going to make here was, look, in my mind, you can put a 50% premium per megajoule of energy on lupins over cereals when you're feeding sheep. And why I say that is that the wastage for feeding oats and barley and wheat, I think, is around 20%. So when you put it on the ground, I reckon you'd lose 15% easily, if not 20% of the grain doesn't get eaten because it's mixed into dirt. We generally find you get nearly 100% utilisation of lupins. Now remember, it's all about energy down the sheep's throat. So if you've only got barley and oats on hand, that's fine, but when you go to the market to buy grain, what I'm suggesting is that if lupins are 3 cents a megajoule and barley's 2.5 cents a megajoule, I would go the lupins all the time because I think that represents better value to your sheep, to your business. The other issue is with barley and wheat particularly, when you're feeding high volumes, like 700-800 grams a head a day, grain poisoning is a real risk. If you get it wrong, sheep don't do that well. With lupins, you can feed whatever you like, whenever you like, as frequently as you like, and it's quite safe. And that's particularly so with young sheep, like weaners. Young weaners generally struggle with high rates of barley. They don't thrive like you think they should at high rates of barley. So in a maintenance situation for weaners, I strongly believe lupins and probably oats are probably the best feed source for them. But if you've got the option to buy lupins or buy barley, I'd put a 50% premium per value of megajoule on lupins for all those reasons. Plus they store a lot easier. Okay, look, just to give you some ballpark sort of figure, when we're talking maintenance, I use this as a quick, dirty calculation for maintenance requirement. I use this as a formula. It's basically 10% of the live weight plus 1.5, and that puts you in the ballpark of what the likely maintenance is. Now, it's not technically correct, but I find it puts you in the right ballpark, and that's where you need to start. Then you feed the sheep, then you see what they do. If they lose weight and you want them to maintain, you feed them a bit more. But this is a good starting point. Now, when we're looking at feeding sheep, or when we're looking at feeding sheep, I think that the two main risks that I see, it's in the timing. Feed prices, the timing of purchases. Buying feed early generally gets you cheap feed. If you wait until you absolutely need it, quite likely everyone else is in the same boat and the price is going to be substantially high. And the problem with that is, once you get into that territory, people generally don't do what they normally would do. So if grain's expensive, people tend to feed less than they probably should. If grain's hard to get, they generally buy less, feed less. If you've got grain on hand that you bought sort of well, people generally do the right thing when it comes to feeding sheep. So I guess my view is that if you've done your plan and you know what you need, it makes good sense to go out and buy the grain while it's still relatively well priced. Now, last week, people could still get lupins at $350 a tonne. I think it's changed a bit this week from what I gather. But it's still, anything under $400 I think is still good value for lupins, even if you don't use them all and you've got them next year. Because I can't see, I'm not predicting what the price of lupins will be, but I strongly suspect they're going to be expensive come harvest and into next year. So the relative cost to carrying excess lupins into next year is low. So if you've got the capacity to buy them, I'd suggest you go out and buy them, because it's highly likely the price is only going to go one way from here on. But once you've got good stores of grain on hand, you're generally more inclined to do the right thing from a profit perspective, but also from a sheep welfare perspective. And the sheep market, timing of sales, if you need to sell sheep, the sooner you recognise that and act on that, the better value you generally get for the sheep, and the quicker they're off the farm. If you wait until you have to sell sheep, the real risk is that everyone else is doing the same thing, the market's come off, and the sheep may not be in the same condition they were a month or 2 months ago. So the value is less. So you're selling poorer quality sheep in a depressed market. So timing of sales really adds value to your business. If you get the timing right, you can sell sheep for good money. And that's still on the cards at the moment. Sheep are still bringing good money at the sale yards. Now this is just to give you some idea as to what the quantum of grain might be if we choose to have sheep in a confinement feeding situation or a drought lot or whatever you want to call it. Now these are used in the last trimester of pregnancy. Now this has relevance for people that might be joining sheep in November, December, and they stay in a feedlot through the summer. So at day 100, you're going to need something like 700 grams of lupins to maintain a pregnant ewe. Now hopefully it won't get to that, but I think if you're thinking that's one of your scenarios, it's useful to know that it's in that order. That's at $350 a tonne, that's 25 cents, so it could be a little bit more by the time we get to that period. But going up to lambing, it gets to nearly 1 kilogram of lupins a day, just so the ewes don't lose weight. Now John will talk to you about that, but it's important that when we've got pregnant ewes, that they don't lose weight, particularly when they start in marginal condition. Because the big cost of getting that bit wrong is we lose ewes. And there's a lot of money tied up. You've invested a lot of money to date, and to lose them at the death knock, that's just loss all the way. Okay, now once we're lambing, now if you're thinking you might be lambing in a feedlot situation, I just want to show you the actual quantity of grain we need to provide to ewes if that's all they're getting. So it's in the order of 1.5 kilos of lupins equivalent on a daily basis. Now typically in the paddock, the sheep don't eat that amount of energy. Lactating ewes typically lose weight. That's quite normal. The issue is if you're in confinement, what's their condition score to start with? If they're skinny to start with, they don't have anything to lose. So you've got to do all you can to feed them what they need. But if they go into the feedlot relatively fat, that gives you a bit of a margin for error, so you can allow them to lose weight through lactation, which is perfectly normal. But it's just, I guess, just to get your head around, for a single bearing ewe, it's 1.5 kilos. For a twin bearing ewe, it's upwards of 2 kilos. So it's a lot of grain to be feeding sheep if you're in a feedlot situation. The point I want to make here is just basically when we're looking at a least cost ration, we're trying to compare cost of energy per megajoule to what we think goes down the sheep's throat. And when we're in a feedlot, particularly, if we're spending a lot of money feeding sheep, it's important to monitor their weight to make sure they're doing what we think they're supposed to be doing. If we think they're maintaining but they're losing weight, it's important to know that. Because sheep that lose weight get to a point where they become a liability to your business. So it's important to know what they're doing, because then you can adjust your feeding program. Particularly in a feedlot, but even in a paddock, if there's a tail, it generally helps to get that tail off and put them into a separate mob. Because when you have sheep losses through these conditions, it's usually the tail that are ones that are dying, and it's usually from poor condition. And often they're in poor condition because of behavioural problems in the flock. You know, the big ones are bullying the small ones. So by simply separating the tail from the main flock, they generally recover on their own. But it's important to do that to minimise stock losses. Okay, now this is just a simple demonstration of how we calculate the average cost of a ration, and it's just a proportion thing. Lupins in this ration are 40% at $3.30, $130 a tonne of the ration. Hay 60%, which is $60 a tonne. The total ration costs $192 a tonne. Pretty simple maths. But we need to do that to know what the cost is of feeding our sheep with the ration you've chosen. And to calculate the energy, it's exactly the same. 40% of 13 is 5.2, 4.2 for the hay. The average energy content of that ration is 9.4 megajoules per kilo. And the cost is simply 19 cents divided by 9.4. So it's 2 cents a megajoule or something like that. It's important to know that so we can make objective comparisons as to what we're feeding. This is a scenario where we've got a dry ewe, we've got 100 dry ewes in a confinement from July all the way through to May. And the objective is just to maintain them. So we're feeding 520 grams of lupins a day. There's 100 ewes and there's 2 rams. That makes up the flock that we're keeping. It ends up being something like, for that duration, it's 170 odd kilograms of lupins in total to put them in a confined feeding situation until the end of May. Now put that up just to demonstrate the quantum of grain that you're likely to need if that's part of your plan. And at $350 a tonne, which may be a little bit out of the money now, it's around $60 a head of cash. So for 100 ewes, it's about $6,000 to get them through in total confinement from now until end of May. Now you may not have them in confinement, you may have them in the paddock, but if you're feeding them pretty much all they need, it's still going to cost you that plus a bit more. There's about a 1.5 to 2 megajoule energy cost of having sheep in the paddock compared to having them in confinement. So I think a dry ewe in a confinement needs about 7 megajoules of energy a day. Out in the paddock it's sort of 1.5, it's 8.5 megajoules thereabouts. So by taking them out of the paddock, putting them in confinement, you're saving 1.5 to 2 megajoules of energy cost on a daily basis. And these numbers are based on 7 megajoules of energy per ewe per day. Oh, it's down there. Yep. Now if we look at that, if we get a bit of a spring, okay, we get some rain in August, we get a bit of a spring, this is a scenario where we get some paddock grazing, so they're in confinement here, they come out of confinement in the spring, we feed them, they get half their energy from grain, half their energy from the paddock in August, they're getting it all from the paddock in September, 75% is coming from the paddock in October, 60% from the paddock in November, and 50% from the paddock in December. So there's a bit of stubble grazing going on potentially. That's brought the total amount of grain needed down to something like 130 kilos of lupins. So you still need, if you get some spring, you're still going to need a reasonable quantity of grain to keep sheep in a feedlot, in a drought lot or a confinement feeding. It's $44. Now, looking at the profitability of sheep, on a DSE basis, they're worth about $50 a DSE, 2016. So you think 2018-19, it'll be $40 to $50 a DSE would be my feeling, that's the numbers we'd work on. Now we use worth about 1.5 DSEs. So just very roughly, see John frowning at me, very roughly you can see there's good money in trying to retain sheep if they have real value to your business, because the profit's there. It's a cash flow consideration. Right, now this is where it gets a bit hairy. I did a scenario where we looked at April lambing in a feedlot. Now we're not promoting that as something people should do, but if you're thinking about it, the quantity of grain goes up to something like 250 kilograms of lupins, and the cost is in excess, well, it's around $80 to $90 a head of grain, of lupins, at $350 a tonne. Now the big thing is here, is that when we get to these, if you're lambing in April, the feed requirement goes up substantially in these months here. And it's around, in May, April, May, it's around 1.8 on average, it's around 1.8 to 2 kilos per head per day, because they're in the peak of lactation. And I've made the assumption that going into that phase, they're in condition score 2.5, so the twinning rate's low, the single rate's relatively high, the dry rate's high. So there's 10% dry ewes, I think I said 70% singles and 20% twins, which is normal for a low twinning rate. And that brings the lupin usage to 1.8 kilos per head per day. But the important figure is, to lamb in a feedlot, they're going to need in excess of 250 kilos of lupins if they're in confinement all the way through. So there's a real cost. And what I'd suggest is, if you don't reliably have access to that grain or that level of cash, lambing in a feedlot is probably something you want to make sure you don't do, because if you get it wrong, it could be potentially disastrous. Because lambing for the ewe is quite a high risk strategy if, nutritionally, she's behind. If they're too skinny and they're not getting enough feed, it won't go well. So that's a very important decision. If someone's contemplating, if you're talking to clients and they're thinking they'll lamb in a feedlot, you need to do some pretty good sums to make sure they've got the capacity physically and financially. I'm not trying to be the doctor of doom, but I think we just need to be quite conscious of what the real risks are of lambing in June. Now I think it's probably worth bringing that up now, is look, the issue with that, and this is the real issue with autumn lambing, is that you don't have any information about the season, you're stuck. Once you join in November, December, you're obviously committing to a lambing in April, May, and the season may not have broken normally, so you don't know. So my thought is, this is possibly a situation where you either decide you're going to lamb in June, July, or you possibly don't join the ewes. So if June, July lambing doesn't appeal from a risk point of view, I'd say, and you're considering having to lamb in a feedlot, option 3 might be just don't join. And we can discuss that at some point in another forum perhaps, but you've just got to be really conscious of lambing in a feedlot. It's a relatively high risk procedure. And people in the east did it in the droughts, so it can be done, but it's not for people with poor sort of sheep management skills. Okay, now the other option we've got is grazing crops. Now this information's come from Ed Riggle and Phil Barrett-Leonard, but it's basically all about grazing the crops relatively early but lightly to have less impact on the crop. But grazing crops provides a source of high energy food, it's got reasonably good protein, and sheep do perform well on crops. Now if you don't have any crops, obviously it's just not an option, clearly. But the issue is in the spring, what are the crops looking like? Do they have capacity for a light graze or not? Later in spring, if you've made the judgment that the crop's going to fail, you've clearly got a stockpile of feed in the paddock that's available for sheep. And sheep, particularly young sheep, will benefit greatly from high quality feed in the spring. What we've got here is the grain yield penalty as a percentage of the uncut control. Okay, so it's basically saying if we graze late, so this is the grazing period here, if we graze late, the effect on the crop is substantial. Grazing early and light, the effect on the crop's minimal. So if we graze late and hard, there's a huge effect, there's a huge penalty on the crop. If we graze late and light, it's negligible. But certainly grazing crops is a real option, and it will add real value to your sheep. So it's going to be a trade-off in value between what am I likely to get for my crop, nothing, something, a lot. What value does it add to my sheep? A lot, a lot, a lot. Now, which sheep to carry through? And I think there's just a few considerations I think we all need to think about. It's basically what's our carrying capacity now and potentially the spring. We'll have the pastures from a space people come in to give you some view as to what the options for spring might be in terms of pasture growth. Now, this one here, what's the current value that we know about? What are our sheep worth today? Potentially what they're worth in the future. Now I say potential because we can only guess at their condition and at their price. Today is certain, we know that. Tomorrow is a bit uncertain, but we've got a rough ballpark figure that we can work to. What can we carry and reliably add value to? So what can we do really, do we think? What have we done before? What's new territory? What's the potential to lose value? So if we get it wrong, what might happen? Okay, and this one here is very important. What's the access to feed and how reliable is that access from a cash point of view and from a physical point of view? If you're running out of feed, what do you think you're going to do? And how reliable is that option to actually get the grain physically? Because if you get there and the grain's not there, you're in a very hard position. And John will talk about a little bit of priority about what sheep we might want to carry through. Now this one here, risk and reward to other livestock, is very important. For every sheep you keep on your farm, it's affecting the sheep next to it. So if you're keeping a mob of wethers because you think they're going to be more value in sort of September, October, they're eating feed that other sheep aren't getting. So if you've got your ewes you want to keep through into 2018 and you're keeping a mob of wethers, whatever the wethers eat, the ewes aren't going to get. And effectively, if you don't get a spring, what the wethers eat, you'll have to feed to the ewes because it's disappearing. So what you keep affects the sheep that are remaining on the farm. So what's the relative value of them compared to what they're taking from the other sheep? Now, I reckon, this is what I think, the sheep you want to hang on to for dear life, assuming sheep have a strong position in your business, okay, making that assumption, the 2.5, 3.5 year old ewes, they're the most robust and from a reproductive point of view valuable sheep, from a current and future value, they're the ones you try and hang on to the most. Rising maidens, mature ewes at 4.5, 5.5, 6.5, 7.5 ewes, they've got a short productive life and they're the ones most at risk if next year isn't very good either. They tend to have a lot of twins, they tend to be a bit skinnier, so in a poor season those older ewes that are joined represent high risk to your sheep flock and your business. So that's why we're sort of saying old ewes, you probably don't want to carry old ewes if you can't do it easily. Ewe lambs and obviously wether lambs, wether hoggets at the bottom of the list. Okay, market options. Look, when we've got small lambs, the air freight market, it's great, but it has its limits. Okay, it says 12 to 22 kilos. How does that sit? Yep. But they've got to be, that's 12 to 22 kilos dressed. Okay, so the live weight's around 30 kilos plus for a merino, something like that. Yep, and a crossbred around the same.
Yeah.
Marginally lighter. Now, typically we wean sheep at 25 kilos. Now, for a lot of people, that's just not going to happen this year. They're probably going to be closer to 20 kilos at weaning. So to think you're going to wean substantial numbers into the air freight market straight away is a bit fanciful, really. Similarly, if you're looking to feed sheep into a feedlot, they generally have a minimum requirement of 25 kilos. So we need to think about that as to what we might do with our lambs. And there could be a case where you have to put money into sheep to feed them up to a point where you can physically move them. They're worth nothing and you can't move them, compared to feeding them $10, $15, $20 of grain just to physically get them off your farm. Now with shippers, and I'm willing to take guidance here, it's really less about frame size at the moment, it's more about condition. So if they're skinny, doesn't matter how big they are, the market's not strong. Correct, thank you.
Fat sheep always sell.
Sorry?
Fat sheep always sell.
Excellent. It's nice to know elders and Landmark have the same view on things. That's good. Oh, look, just a point. Look, in farmer feedlots, typically the conversion ratio is 10 to 1. I think if you read all your books, it's 7 to 8. In reality, it's closer to 10. The professional feedlotters can get it down to 6 to 8, but generally my experience with farmers, it's 10 to 15 for a whole range of reasons. But if you're doing your sums, really work on that as a minimum, because I reckon for most people that's what it would be. So if you're looking to feed weaners up, at least 10 to 1. Okay, what I'll just do now to finish is in the droughts back in the 2000s in the east, following that sort of period, Holmes and Sackett did a reasonably extensive survey of sheep farmers in how they drought-fed sheep. And I got, a long time ago, I got this information from David Sackett. It's basically the results of a survey from people that drought-lotted sheep through that sort of phase in the eastern states. The things they looked at were these points here: death rates, culling rates, right down to how long did sheep stay on the feed in feedlots. These are the average results. Death rates, probably should say mortality, were relatively low, but the range was huge. 22%. That's you'd have to say that's an outright disaster. But the average at 1.8 suggests there weren't many of them. Time on feed, this is interesting. There were some sheep on feed for more than a year, but the average was 136 days, obviously. Mob sizes varied a fair bit, but around 1,200. So we're not talking thousands and thousands in a mob, we're talking 1,200, okay? Right, and our troughs. Do we have troughs or not? Feeding on the ground, slightly lower mortality rates than feeding in a trough. That's great, because feeding on the ground is a lot easier. But look, there's a mob size effect. When we have small mobs, feeding on the ground works a bit better than feeding in a trough. But once we get to big mobs, troughs are more important. Now what we've got here is mortality rate and mob size. So as mob size is increasing, feeding on the ground has higher mortality rates. Mortality rates with sheep fed on the ground increases as mob size goes up. Now you can imagine you've got 5,000 sheep scrambling for the same trail. You get a lot of competition, weaker sheep get pushed out, that's sort of what happens. So after, just from this graph, obviously around 2,000 plus, that's where troughs start to be essential in terms of minimising losses. Now managing the tail size, this is really what makes or breaks feedlots, drought lots, confinement feeding. It's about taking the weaker ones out and putting them somewhere on their own. And it's a behavioural response. The weaker sheep get out-competed by the bigger sheep So they get hassled by the bigger sheep, they get bullied by the bigger sheep, and it affects how they eat and how they perform. Simply taking them off, put them on their own, they just recover without any other special treatment. So drafting the tail off on a regular basis is essential. Now, it's not daily, it's not weekly. So the summary from that work was, if you're putting sheep into a feedlot, we're trying to keep them at something like a 2,000 per hectare feedlot, so that's 1 every 5 square metres, so it's not intense. When you see them in that sort of situation, you think there's a fair bit of room still. So they don't have to be pushed up tight. We try and keep the mob size between 1,000 and 2,000. And I guess they're suggesting that we manage the tail every 2 months. But I guess it comes back to trusting judgment, that if you can see a tail, you need to act on it. I guess my view of farmers is generally they're very good at observing things. If your sheep have changed, people generally pick it up pretty quickly. The weakness is how quickly they do something about it, because there's other things going on. You know, if you're busy seeding, your sheep are losing weight, you're thinking, well, I haven't got time to do anything about it. But in a feedlot, if you see a tail developing, it's very important to do something about it quickly, because that's where your losses come from. Okay, now roughage. Look, nutritionally, sheep don't need roughage in their diet. They can get by on a completely fibre-free diet if they have to. But one thing, fibre in a feedlot, in a drought lot, in a confined feeding environment for a long time, one thing roughage does, it affects the sheep's behaviour. Now ruminants, by their very nature, they ruminate, right? So they've got to stop what they're doing, bring it up, chew it, swallow it, bring it up, chew it, right? That gives them something to do. When they have a very low fibre diet, they don't do that, they've got time on their hands. And what happens is, the bigger ones then look around for something to do and they pick on the smaller ones. What that does is, that just makes the smaller ones lose weight. They stop eating, they're stressed. By adding fibre to the diet, roughage to the diet, it just moderates their behaviour. And that's what's happening here. Lower mortality rates, and it's simply a behavioural. It's not a nutritional effect, it's a behavioural response. Generally, the worse quality roughage, the better response you get. So this is hay versus straw. This is poor doer, so it's not mortality, it's just sheep not doing well. And it's all about modifying the sheep's behaviour. It's also good from a ration point of view, because straw is relatively cheaper than hay. I think that's the thing. And we're not talking a great deal, we're only talking 1 kilogram a head a week of straw, so it's not huge volumes of straw they need. Okay, so the recommendation for a confinement feeding is about done? Yep, good.
Questions?
And yep, so you can do that, and I think that's it. Yep, so good. We'll take questions now if there's any, Mandy.
I would like to thank Ashley for that.